learned that while we'd been engaged in these cases, an extraordinary event had taken place down in Nicaragua. What had happened is Eden Pastora, who was the famous Comandante Zero, the Sandinista hero who had led major military operations against the dictator Somoza, had become disenchanted with the Sandinista government. The Sandinista government, in response to the attacks and harassment by the Contras, had begun to take less and less popular positions on things, had shut down some of the media, had taken steps that made it very difficult for them to provide supplies to people in the stores. It was becoming more and more difficult for them. And Comandante Zero, Eden Pastora, had become disenchanted and had decided that he was going to leave Nicaragua, indeed was going to go south into Costa Rica, and was going to set up a new Contra group, an independent Contra group, not a Contra group working with the Somoza generals up in Honduras and working with the CIA that had been working under Bill Casey, but was going to set up an independent Contra force. But what had happened during the times we were doing the sanctuary trial and the Greensboro trial had happened was that there had been major pressure applied to this group, ARDE, down in Costa Rica, and to Eden Pastora, to force them to come under the command of the Honduran military generals, or the actual military generals in Honduras that were the old Somoza generals. And in May of 1984, Eden Pastora had called a public press conference, and he was going to denounce the FDN, the major Contra movement, and the United States Central Intelligence Agency for attempting to co-opt and subvert his nationalistic Contra group. At that press conference held in the jungle camp of Eden Pastora on May 30th, Memorial Day of 1984, you can see the videotapes to this day as they came up the river into the jungle camp and the numerous journalists climbed out. You see among them a Danish journalist with a large aluminum camera case with a baseball cap on, walking with them, chatting merrily into the building where the press conference was to be held. You see this man, Per Anker Hansen, move to the front of the room on the videotape and place his large aluminum camera case next to the table where Eden Pastora would hold his press conference. When Eden Pastora comes into the room and all of the journalists begin to surge to the front of the base camp room and the beginning of the press conference starts, you see a young woman, Maria, bring a cup of coffee to Comandante Zero and accidentally kick over the camera case, which falls on its side, and no one pays much attention. She gives him the coffee and the press conference commences. What you then see is this alleged Danish journalist begin to skulk out of the room, moving across the side of the room on the videotape and out the door. And immediately thereafter, a deafening roar engulfs the building, destroying everyone in sight, killing 8 people immediately, killing 3 international journalists, including an American journalist, Linda Fraser, blowing off the arms and legs, blinding, tearing off the limbs of the journalists assembled. Indeed, 24 people were massively injured, and indeed, everyone would have been slaughtered by the bomb had it not been for the fortuitous event of it having been turned onto its side. Because the bomb was made, it turns out, of deadly C4 explosives, the types of explosives that are second only to nuclear devices in their explosive capacity, a thing which is very difficult to obtain unless you have intelligence contacts with the Central Intelligence Agency and other intelligence groups. In fact, what had happened, because it had been turned on its side, is that it blew the entire roof off the building and blew the entire floor out instead of laying waste to everyone laterally. Now, when the bulletins went out across Costa Rica that this had happened, one of the people listening at home on the radio was a young reporter by the name of Martha Honey. She was a young American reporter, but she reported for the Canadian Broadcast Corporation and reported for the London Sunday Times. Her husband had been at this press conference, Tony Avergan. Tony Avergan was the ABC television cameraman who had been assigned to go to the press conference to film the press conference. He had been devastated by the bomb, had torn out a portion of his side, had burnt the whole arms of his hand, had shrapneled him in the face and chest, and he was in critical condition and flown out by helicopter from the hospital later to the U.S., where he underwent months of plastic surgery. Martha Honey, being the person that she is, insisted upon going to the United States Newspaper Guild and asked for a grant to look into who it was that perpetrated this horrendous bombing, to work with her fellow journalists to bring to justice these people. She began her investigation and had an extraordinary event occur. In early 1985, during her investigation, a young man by the name of Carlos Rojas Chinchilla, a young carpenter down in Costa Rica, was sitting at a restaurant and bar a couple blocks from the United States Embassy when in came three men. And one of them was left at the door and the other two left. And that man that was left at the door looked around and came over to Carlos and sat down and told him that he wanted him to help him, that he had to escape, that he was a participant in the terrorist bombing at Lepenka that murdered the people at the press conference, and that he was part of a terrorist band, an international band of Contras, who were now planning to blow up the United States Embassy, who were going to assassinate the United States ambassador to Costa Rica, Louis Tams, who were based on the ranch of a millionaire American rancher by the name of John Hull. That these had been the people indeed that had carried out the assassination of the journalists and were planning to kill the United States ambassador, to instigate a major event, to cause a provocation for the U.S. to blame the bombing of their embassy on the Sandinista government and to launch a military strike against that government. This man shared the information with Carlos, and Carlos, to his utter amazement, later learned that some people had been arrested, a few people off Hull's ranch, who fit the exact description of these people. And when he realized that this was true, he went to the only North American family that he knew to have them go warn the embassy. And the daughter of that family happened to know Martha Honey and went to Martha, shared the information. They went to talk to this man, David, and they began a series of interviews through Carlos. In the public parks, on tape recorders, in churches, in hotel basements, all across the city, gathering the information about this terrorist group. Until one day, Carlos and David were caught by John Hull's terrorists in a park and thrown in the back of a car and held at gunpoint and brought to the ranch, where they were held in a wooden shed. And David told them that they were going to be killed if they didn't get out of there. And so the two of them, taking their lives in their hands, leaped on this guard and knocked him down and jumped, broke through a window, and ran into the jungle in a fusillade of bullets, and escaped through the jungles, and eventually made their way back to civilization, where they were picked up. And they began to share their story with the Costa Rican authorities, with the intelligence, with the people there. However, the Monge government that was in power at that time was sympathetic to the Contras, and so therefore the journalists themselves had to continue the investigation. And weeks later they learned that David, who had run off to a separate place, had been recaptured by John Hull's men, had been brought to Hull's ranch and tortured to death and buried on John Hull's ranch. And at that point, they had to take Carlos out of the country and to assist him in escaping. And then death threats began to come daily to the home telephone of Martha and Tony Avergan, telling them that they had to stop this investigation, that they would be killed, that their children would be killed if they did not leave. They then contacted their journalist acquaintances and asked for help across the nation. And they contacted us at the Christic Institute and asked us to help. And that is what we do at the Christic Institute. That's why we come to people such as you to ask your help to get this information out across the country. And when we began to investigate, we began to confirm this story of this terrorist group. And of course, we had the additional information about the movement of guns and explosives and hardware from the U.S. down to this ranch. And at that point, Martha and Tony prepared a report which they published in Costa Rica, and John Hull sued them for libel. down in Costa Rica, which in Costa Rica is a felony criminal charge of which you are presumed guilty unless you can prove that you're innocent. The Christic Institute went in and undertook the defense of Martha and Tony, helped them organize witnesses and bring them to the bar of justice, and brought them on to testify, and defeated John Hull. And very, very prophetically, John Hull, in a major frump at the end of the trial, stomped out of the courtroom and turned and said, "This isn't over yet." And little did he know how right he was. For we had resolved at that point to undertake a thorough investigation and prosecution of these people in the United States. What we learned from our investigation was that this terrorist band on John Hull's ranch, in addition to bringing in all the military equipment and training and dispensing the terrorists into Nicaragua, had in fact been funding their operation by the smuggling of hundreds of tons of cocaine in from Colombia, because they had virtual carte blanche to bring this military equipment from the U.S. down to the ranch through Ilopango. In fact, the U.S. government officials in the Reagan administration were turning a blind eye and a deaf ear to those shipments. And so they would move the planes down with the military equipment down through Ilopango into the Costa Rican ranch, load up with 600-pound loads of cocaine, and fly back into the United States, coming right back up the same channels that they had cleared through the radar to allow them to bring these guns to those who were the moral equivalent of our founding fathers. And as we began to research the statutes that were available, we discovered, much to our amazement, that there was this federal racketeering statute. There was, in fact, a federal criminal statute, the same one that they just prosecuted the 8 mob leaders in New York for. And at the very bottom of this statute, it said, by the way, if you run a business and your business has been injured by the activities of such a criminal enterprise, you can sue that criminal enterprise and recover 3 times your actual damages. And we began to interview people and discover that Tony Abergon was, in fact, a private businessman. In fact, was a freelance cameraman who was hired by ABC to go and do the Lepenka press conference. And the bombing had destroyed all of his television equipment. His business had been injured. And being the defenders of free enterprise that we are, we determined that we were going to vindicate the business community of America and close down this criminal enterprise. Now, all of this was preliminary to finding out the really important information in this case. Because once we had gotten hold of this federal criminal statute, we learned that when you undertake to prosecute a particular overt act of a criminal enterprise under the Racketeer-Influenced Corrupt Organization Act, you can also sue all of the members who are participants in the more general criminal enterprise, of which that is just one overt act. And so we then turned our attention to the criminal enterprise itself, which of course was the federal criminal conspiracy to violate the United States Neutrality Act to mount a criminal war against the government of Nicaragua. And when we began to investigate who was participating in that enterprise, we had another fortuitous visit from a former military intelligence agent who came to us and he said, "Don't you realize who the people are that you're dealing with here?" Well, we didn't know whether to pretend to be very knowledgeable and therefore stupid, or to say like we always do, no, we don't know much more than the American people know. What's the facts? And he said, I will tell you who they are, and when you undertake your investigation, you will discover what they are. The people you want, he said, are Theodore Shackley, Thomas Kleins, Richard Secord, Albert Hakim, Rafael Chichi Quintero, and a man by the name of Eric von Marbod. Okay, we said. And we went out to find out who these people were. In the extraordinary series of events that began to unfold, which resulted in the ruling that you heard about this past Friday, where the federal court in Miami said that what you have here is an ongoing criminal enterprise which has gone on since 1960. Because what we discovered is that the man who was directing the operations supplying the guns and military hardware into the Contras in Central America was indeed a man by the name of Theodore Shackley. Theodore Shackley had been the worldwide director of covert operations for the United States Central Intelligence Agency in 1976 under George Bush, when he was the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. And as we began our investigation of Mr. Shackley, we discovered that he indeed had been the man in 1961 who had run the major Contra operation against the Cuban Socialist Revolutionary Government, starting in 1961. That the United States CIA had run a secret covert war against Cuba, about which the American public knew virtually nothing, both before and after the Bay of Pigs. And I will now tell you what it is that we all need to know. What we discovered was that back in late 1959, when Fidel Castro drove the dictator Batista from Cuba, he also drove out the organized crime syndicate from Cuba. The major criminal operation that was operating under the name of Resorts International. It was Meyer Lansky's major criminal syndicate that ran the casinos and hotels and prostitution rings in Havana. They indeed were business partners with Batista, and they were all driven from Cuba in Havana in 1959. They came to southern Florida, and there they were contacted by then Vice President Richard Nixon in the Nixon-Eisenhower administration. Indeed, Richard Nixon was the point man who was responsible for establishing inside the National Security Council a secret committee that was responsible for mounting basically a contra-war against Cuba. That they had determined that they did not like the politics or the economics of the Cuban government, and therefore they were going to secretly recruit the ultra-right-wing supporters of the dictator Batista and train them at a military base in southern Florida in the Keys, and to set up another military training base in Guatemala. And there they would train these people to constitute a contra-guerrilla force, and that they would undertake attacks into Cuba, riding on swift boats. They would blow up bridges, burn crops, poison export materials from Cuba to destroy their economic infrastructure. That this operation began in late 1959, and it was codenamed Operation 40. But not satisfied with that, then Vice President Richard Nixon received communications from a man by the name of Santo Trafficante. Santo Trafficante had been the lieutenant for Meyer Lansky, running the Havana operations for the New York mob. And he had come to Florida and had learned about this secret Operation 40, since a large portion of the people that had been recruited by the CIA to work in that had been the criminal elements working for Batista and Santo Trafficante in Havana. And learning about that, he wanted to help. Being the red-blooded patriot that he was, and of course the beneficiary of a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise that had been driven from Havana. And they wanted to reestablish that in Havana. And he reached out through two men. One was a man by the name of John Roselli. Another man was a man by the name of Sam Giancana, the Don of the Mafia in Chicago. These two men were designated by Santo Trafficante to meet with a representative of Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon selected a man with whom he was having an extraordinarily secret contact. The man who was the head of the empire of Howard Hughes, a man by the name of Robert Mayhew. Because of the secrecy of their ongoing relationships, he was selected to undertake this super secret communication. This meeting took place at the Fontainebleau Hotel in early 1960. And there, Richard Nixon, through his representatives, and Santo Trafficante, through his representatives, agreed to set up a sub-organization inside Operation 40, which was a professional assassination unit. And this unit was given the responsibility for carrying out the political assassination of Fidel Castro, his brother Raul Castro, Che Guevara, and 5 other men in the leadership of the Cuban government. This group was recruited out of the Operation 40 people, known to Richard Nixon and a limited number of people alone, and was trained in a secret triangular fire base down in Mexico. This particular group had on it a number of very interesting people. People that you are coming to hear about every day that we live. One of the men on this secret team, this assassinations unit, was a man by the name of Felix Gomez. You know him as, he's Felix Rodriguez, and you know him as Max Gomez. The man that was named by Hassenfuss as the man who directed the Ilopango airlifts into Nicaragua. Another man on this secret assassination team in early 1960, put together by Richard Nixon, was a man by the name of Ramon Medina, whose real name is Jose Posada Carrillo, who was the second man running the Ilopango airlift over into Nicaragua. Another man on this group was a man by the name of Rafael Chichi Quintero, the man who supervised the construction of the secret airstrip in Costa Rica that you've heard so much about of late. Indeed, the man who delivered the $2 million that was being given to bribe out Mr. Buckley from the Libyan, or the terrorists in Beirut, that was given by Mr. Ross Perot. Chichi Quintero and Tom Clines are the ones that delivered the money. The other people in this assassination team that you've probably heard about are a man by the name of Frank Sturgis, later caught in the Watergate Hotel in 1971 under then President Richard Nixon. With him in the Watergate Hotel was a man by the name of Rolando Martinez, another man on the assassination team in 1960 run by Richard Nixon. Another man by the name of Diaz was on that assassination team, also found in the Watergate Hotel. 2 more men, Raul Villaverde, on that shooter team. Ricardo Chavez was also on that team. Running that team, one of the directors of that team was a man by the name of E. Howard Hunt. This particular group had the extraordinary authority given to them by this secret group of National Security Council people headed up by the Vice President of the United States to carry out the slaughter, murder of the political leadership of the Cuban government. Now that operation ran all the way to 1961 when President Kennedy came to office. All the indications are that he was never told about the assassination team. He was told about the Operation 40, the Contra operation against Cuba, and his young, industrious brother Bob decided that he would transmute Operation 40 into a full-scale invasion, which they tried in April of 1961 in the disastrous Bay of Pigs. They were all killed or captured, and by June of 1961, Bobby Kennedy had dropped back and reestablished the Operation 40 program, which they renamed Operation Mongoose. That particular program was put under the command and control of a young 34-year-old CIA official by the name of Theodore Shackley. His director of training was a man by the name of Tom Clines. They ran the Contra War along with Ed Lansdale, against the Cuban government from 1961 to 1965. And then a very strange series of events began to unfold. In 1965, this entire unit and team was transferred to Laos in Southeast Asia. Theodore Shackley became the deputy chief of station under Gordon Jurgensen. He brought with him Tom Kleins. They brought with them Rafael Chichi Quintero. They also brought with them Felix Rodriguez. They also brought with them Jose Posada Carrillo. Assassins, professional assassins, they brought with them. By 1966, Theodore Shackley and Tom Kleins were peculiarly supplying air power to a man by the name of Von Pao, a major opium trafficker in Laos, who was engaged in a three-way war with two other men for control of the opium trade in Laos. Tom Kleins supervised the air war, gave air power to Von Pao. They actually figured out a way of dropping bombs on these drug dealers for Von Pao. The man who ran the air operation for Von Pao under Tom Kleins was a young major in the Air Force by the name of Richard Secord. By the beginning of 1966, both of the opponents of Von Pao in this war for the opium market had been assassinated. And Von Pao was the undisputed controller of the opium trade in Laos. Very interestingly, he then, out of the largesse of his heart, decided that he would contribute an ongoing portion of the heroin income to finance the secret training of the Mao tribesmen, the Hmong, down in southern Laos. They were being trained by the same man who was the commander of the Guatemalan base for the Cubans. And they were sent out to carry out the covert assassination of suspected communist sympathizers throughout Laos, Thailand, and Cambodia. By 1966, this program had been formalized into a group called the Special Operations Group, also known as the Joint Task Force on Unconventional Warfare, based in Vientiane. It was placed under the control of the military, even though it was in fact run by Theodore Shackley and Tom Kleins of the CIA. The man who was chosen as the military commander for that unit that supervised the Mao tribesmen in the assassination program was Major General John K. Singlaub. The deputy air wing commander for the Special Operations Group became Richard Secord. In the end of December of 1968, a young Marine Corps recent graduate of the Naval Academy joined the Special Operation Group in Vientiane, a man by the name of Oliver North. One of the commanders of the Army Special Forces units in the Special Operations Group was a man by the name of Dewey Owen, the older brother of Rob Owen. This group functioned to supervise the political assassination of some 100,000 non-combatant civilians in Laos and Cambodia and Thailand, young mayors, bookkeepers, clerks, school teachers, to attempt to eliminate the infrastructure of that society for fear that it would fall into the hands of the communists. In 1968, Theodore Shackley became the chief of station in Laos, and a man by the name of Santo Traficante from southern Florida flew to Southeast Asia and met in a hotel in Saigon with Von Pao. And by the end of 1968, Santo Traficante had become the #1 importer and trafficker in China white heroin in the United States. The China white heroin began to flow, and the commensurate profits began to flow to Von Pao. And the size of the Mao tribesman training group that was committing the assassinations began to burgeon accordingly. In 1969, Theodore Shackley was transferred to become the chief of station in Vietnam. And they established the now infamous Phoenix program that carried out the political assassination of some additional 60,000 non-combatant civilians, non-Viet Cong civilian operators in the country. He remained in that position until 1972, when Theodore Shackley and Tom Clines were brought back to the United States and put in charge of Western Hemisphere operations for the agency. Now, since they don't do an awful lot in Canada, and they're doing less and less in the United States, that leaves you Central and Latin America. Tom Clines and Theodore Shackley ran the Track 2 operation against Salvador Allende in Chile and supervised the political capture and assassination of his chief of staff, General Snyder, and eventually the assassination of Allende himself. And when that had been accomplished in September of 1973, Theodore Shackley was transferred to become the head of Far East operations for the CIA. Now, at that point, we reach an extraordinarily important junction here, because Theodore Shackley and Tom Clines and his cohorts had come to the conclusion that the waffling American democracy was not going to continue their effort in Vietnam. And they were not going to continue their effort against the communists. And so they began an extraordinary program by means of which they took more and more money from Von Pau's heroin funds, had them transferred into Vietnam under the auspices of having to carry out a more and more massive Phoenix program, but in fact brought more money in there than was necessary and began to embezzle this money from Von Pau's heroin sales in this black program and transfer the money secretly to a bank in Australia, the Nugan Hand Bank. Millions of dollars were transferred between 73 and 75 in an extraordinarily sophisticated program. What they did is they had Tom Clines and Richard Secord load millions of dollars into suitcases and get on an airplane and fly to Australia and unload the money and put it in the bank accounts. That went on from 73 to 75, and they also began to pilfer thousands of tons of U.S. military equipment from Vietnam and transfer it to a secret cache in Thailand. So that when the war ended in 1975, all of these people simply transferred. Where did they transfer to? Iran. Richard Secord was made the Director of Foreign Military Sales for the United States Pentagon in the Middle East. And where did Theodore Shackley go? Theodore Shackley was promoted from the Director of Far East Operations for the CIA to be the Assistant Deputy Director for the CIA in charge of worldwide covert operations under George Bush. He, in fact, anticipated Theodore Shackley being named Director of the CIA if, in fact, Ford had won the presidency and the Republicans had remained in office. Theodore Shackley almost certainly would have been made the director of the CIA. But when Carter won and Stansfield Turner became head of the Central Intelligence Agency, these people continued their operation of pilfering funds and sending them to this secret fund and established a unauthorized, secret, illegal assassination program in Iran, working with the Shah and with the Savak. The man who was the director of their operations in Iran was a man by the name of Edwin P. Wilson. His assistant was Frank Turple. These people carried out the assassination of many opponents of the Shah in Iran between 1976 and 1978. Now, that operation generated a peculiar resistance on the part of the Central Intelligence Agency that had not authorized it, was not supervising it, and they began to dismiss people from the CIA who were in covert operations. You recall that history with President Carter moving the people out of covert ops of CIA. They began to put pressure on Theodore Shackley to get him to stop some of his operations. But the fact is that they did not stop him, that what he did is he formed a private company in which he joined as partners with Edwin Wilson, Richard Secord, and Erich von Marbod. They formed a company originally known as the International Research and Trade Corporation, which later became EATSCO, the Egyptian American Transport and Service Company. This company, through the good offices of Erich von Marbod, who had been the Assistant Secretary of Defense, filtered to that company all of the contracts to ship all of the weapons to Egypt in the Camp David Accords. And they began to make hundreds of millions of dollars in that company. And when it was discovered that Edwin P. Wilson was selling C4 explosives to Gaddafi and Assistant United States Attorney Larry Barcella insisted upon indicting him. Larry Barcella began to investigate Shackley, Kleins, Secord, von Marbod, but he was told to stop. And his indictments were insisted upon being restricted to simply Edwin Wilson and Frank Turple. And that was a terrible mistake, as it turns out, because what happened is Shackley was, while they were thinking of indicting him, a decision was made to just tell him to resign, he and Tom Kleins from the CIA. Who was it that made that decision? The Deputy Director for Operations of the CIA at the time, Frank Carlucci. Such that by the beginning of 1979, when the United States people, the United States Congress, the United States President, and the head of the Central Intelligence Agency had resolved in the beginning of 1979 to cut off all military supplies to Somoza, Ted Shackley and Tom Kleins, at the end of February and early March of 1979, send Edwin Wilson to visit with Somoza. And they establish a contract where they're going to be selling military hardware to the dictator in total opposition to the United States policy. But after all, these men were now private citizens. They had not been indicted. They were running this company making billions of dollars. And they had access to all of the end-user certificates to get the military equipment. They had access to all of the contractors. And they continued to sell the equipment. And even when Somoza fled in July of 1979 and went to a place called North Cay in the Bahamas, Shackley and Kleins sent their people to visit with him again and reestablish the contract, now to continue to sell them the military equipment in their new incarnation as the Contras. This indeed is the secret team that continued the flow of weapons. They continued the program of political assassinations. They would target the people who had to be assassinated, and they would send the information to a man who was then based in Army intelligence, a man by the name of Rafael Chichi Quintero, who at the same time was the man visiting with the Contras, taking their orders for military equipment and making sure that they were filled. And then Quintero would pass the information as to who should be assassinated on to Tom Kleins and Theodore Shackley, who would then pass the information on to a man by the name of Buckley, who was the head of the Central Intelligence Agency's anti-terrorist program. This operation continued all the way up until Reagan became president. When Reagan became president in January of 1981, a series of interesting conversations began to take place in the White House, chaired by then Chief of Staff Ed Meese, along with Vice President Bush, President Reagan, Director of the CIA, Bill Casey, and the first National Security Advisor, Richard Allen. And by June of 1981, they had resolved that they would take over from the secret team the supplying of the military hardware and the weapons and the training. And they resolved in a June 1981 National Security Decision Directive that they would assign a man by the name of Victor M. Canestraro from the CIA to head up and take over the operation that had been run by Chichi Quintero. That operation ran, as we recalled at the beginning of our discussion, throughout these strange series of falsehoods about they didn't know the Contras, yeah, they were funding the Contras, and blah, 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 went all the way to the end of 1983, when in fact they were caught mining the harbors and passing out the assassination manual, and it became clear that in fact Congress was going to pass the Boland Amendment to prohibit their activities. So what did they do? They sent a young man who was now a lieutenant colonel in the National Security Council, Oliver North, to contact the secret team to say, why don't you do it some more? You did it from March of 79 until 81. Why don't you sell the weapons to the Contras and give them what they need, which they did. However, they needed a cover story, After all, everyone knew the agency had been supplying them for years now. If they continued to have the same amount, people might suspect the agency was doing it. So what they decided to do was to have a cover story, so they sent Oliver North to Gray and Company, a public relations firm of spooks in Washington, who a vice president of at that time, we understand, was a man by the name of John Tower. And they sought out a young man by the name of Rob Owen from that office, and he set up a thing called Idea Incorporated, and he began to provide the private inspiration around our country to help these poor Contras. And he was sent to get a man to head up that operation, a man by the name of General John K. Singlaub. And that operation raised probably $5 to $6 million total, most of which they spent on their little Learjets flying around the world. And yet it gave a cover to this massive influx of weapons to the Contras, all being run by the secret team. And so then when it was decided that the administration had to undertake this secret deal with the Iranians, they figured, who better than the secret team? After all, in for a penny, in for a pound. So these were the people that were sent, Secord and the other men, to Iran to deliver the cake and the Bible and the missiles. Now, a series of puzzling questions remain, however, because why is it the administration was not so distressed earlier when they were holding all of the hostages? Why was it they became only terribly distressed in 1984 when Mr. Buckley was kidnapped? When Mr. Buckley was kidnapped and tortured, and they became intensely interested in getting him out. You recall we were told he was an independent businessman in Beirut. Then we were told that he was the station chief of the CIA in Beirut. What we were not told is that he had been the director of the anti-terrorist program for the CIA. And what was it that he knew that made this man so terribly dangerous in their hands? And why was it that we sent the Iranians 40 tractor-trailer loads of tow missiles after we knew he was already dead? What do you think it was he told them that was worth all that? And why was it that the Iranians sent a man by the name of Ghubbanifar to establish contact to see if they could get the weapons in exchange for something? And who did Mr. Ghubbanifar go to? Oliver North? Poindexter? Bud McFarlane? No. He went to Theodore Shackley. Ghubbanifar, in November of 1984, met with Theodore Shackley in Hamburg and decided that this was so serious, something had to be paid to these people. And who were the people? Were they moderates in the Iranian government? What will be discovered is that they were the very people who had tortured Mr. Buckley. These were the people to whom Mr. Buckley had been delivered from Beirut. He, in fact, was taken from Beirut to Tehran, was tortured to death in Tehran on videotape. What was it that he told them that made it worth paying all of that hush money? The fact of the matter is that because of this secret team that has been functioning in the bowels of our government for 25 years, the United States has not been humiliated We have been blackmailed. And who is it that doesn't know what we have been doing? Is it the Russians? Do you think it's the Cubans? Is it the Nicaraguans? It is you, and it is me. It is the American people that these people fear. Because of the program of assassinations, the horrible, dark secrets that they know, of the source of their funding from the largest shipments of heroin into our country for the past 20 years, to the influx of over 1 ton of cocaine per week coming in through a shrimp company down in Miami owned by Francisco Paco Chanes that has been financing these black covert operations. So the questions that are floating are not indeed the right questions. Should we be asking ourselves the questions, do you think that Donald Reagan should resign? Do you think maybe Mr. Meese should quit? Do you think all of these lower guys will be cleaned up by Frank Carlucci? Do you think these were a group of subordinates acting without authority within the White House? Or is this in fact more like Watergate, where the congressional committees will go so far as to impeach Mr. Reagan, impeach Mr. Bush, impeach Mr. Meese, prosecute Mr. North and Secord and Hakeem? Because let me say to you, if in fact that is all that happens, we will be dealing with a small cancerous nodule on the nose of the president. Whereas in fact, what we are dealing with is a cancer deep in the chest of our body politic. And the intelligence community will tell us, along with the Republican Party, please, we can't operate. The body politic is not healthy and strong enough. Please, maybe we don't have cancer. Hope we don't have cancer, maybe it will go away. You cannot do this. And the Democrats are suggesting that the people's confidence in our governmental structures will be too shaken if this information is made available to our public. The fact of the matter is, these are the people who have never had confidence in the structures of our constitutional government, have never obeyed the American people, have never had confidence in the United States Congress. These are the people who have been dealing in the back alleys and in the underworld for 25 years. Will we listen to those people when they say, please, our body politic is not strong enough to survive the operation? No, we won't. The fact is that this operation will be undertaken. Our body politic is healthy. Our body politic will rid itself of this cancer. And the people who will make that so are you and me, and the millions of people across our country who will not stand for this type of hypocrisy, who will not allow our country to take these types of positions by means of which we can be so clearly blackmailed. This will be put to a stop. It will be put to a stop now, and we will not be allowed to just face these minor questions. We will do this work. The Christic Institute has the federal case that has now been endorsed by the federal court system. We now have federal subpoena power. We know that this group is not, in fact, the moral equivalent of our founding fathers. They are indeed the moral equivalent of the mafia. And they will be treated as such.